Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to get started in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and welcome if you're joining us online or here in the room or on TV channel 11. So we are going to begin this new series. I'm calling it Restoration, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. You see that I hyphenated it, and I'll tell you why I hyphenated Ezra and Nehemiah here in a second. But this is a focus on restoration, the restoration of the people of Judah coming out of exile in the Babylonian kingdom and back to their homeland. This is the restoration of the temple, which was destroyed in 586 BC and is now going to be rebuilt during our study and will be completed 70 years later in 516 BC. And it's the restoration of the city of Jerusalem and the walls around the city specifically. We're not actually going to read Ezra and Nehemiah today. We're going to start with a historical overview and some background, and we're actually going to go into the book of 2 Kings and the book of Jeremiah and the book of Daniel, because we're going to set the stage and explain why are we even here in the first place. How did we get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and where do those books fit within history so that it makes it clear what we're seeing and why. So we'll start first with a historical overview. We'll talk briefly about the author and the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah, the political environment, the kingdoms that were there at the time, and where we're even talking about in the world. And then we'll talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which led to a 70-year exile period, followed by Daniel's prophecy, who was reading the prophet Jeremiah, who said, before any of this happened, I'm going to destroy the temple, I'm going to send you into captivity, and 70 years later, I'm going to bring you out. So everything that happens in this book of Nehemiah is a fulfillment of prophecy that Jeremiah said would happen, and Daniel, while he's in captivity, reads Jeremiah and sees what's going on. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. We'll cover chapters 1 and 2 next week. All right, so historical overview. We're going to take out the yellow card, and I just want to say a few comments about history. Ezra and Nehemiah is difficult to follow and difficult to understand the events and the times and the people without a little bit of historical context. To some degree, when it was written, the author assumed that the reader would know a lot of what had happened. And so here we are, 2,600 years removed. We've got to go back and look and see what was going on in that time period. And so that's what we'll start with. Now, I'll also say I'm a pastor and a pilot, not a archaeologist or paleontologist. So I love history, and I've spent a lot of time studying. And my goal is to be as accurate and diligent with the facts as I can possibly be. But I may make mistakes in things I say about historical events. And if I do, and I catch it, because I always go back and watch the teaching, just so I can see what I've said that I need to say differently or fix or do better or make more clear. If I make mistakes and I catch it, I'm going to come back and correct it for you and tell you what I said wrong. If you catch something because you've read something or you know something or it just doesn't sound right compared to what you've always heard, then please speak up. And I don't mind if you call me out right here and say, that's not right, Aaron. Here's the real answer. And then I'll correct that. Or you can tell me later and I'll come back and correct it the next week and I'll give you credit for correcting it too. The other thing that I want to comment just about history in general is that history is not settled science. And we've heard that term a lot in the last few years. History, first of all, is not science at all. Science is concerned with making a hypothesis about what should or could happen, creating an experiment, testing that hypothesis, and determining what the results are and whether that hypothesis is true. We can't do that with history. We can't recreate history and test history to see if that's true. Now, science gives us tools and methodologies and techniques that we can use to help investigate the evidence that we have. But history is a matter of looking for evidence, interpreting that evidence, studying the eyewitness accounts and the records that other people have written third hand, and trying to piece everything together and make sense of all of the facts and the evidence that we have according to the timelines that we understand. And history, because of that, is constantly being updated. The other thing about that is, when I look back 100 years ago at history, I can see 100 years ago with much more clarity than I can see 1,000 years ago. I have much better evidence, it's much more recent, and historians will still debate things that happened only 100 years ago, right? I mean, how many historians are still talking about the assassination of JFK? And that wasn't that long ago. So 100 years ago, I have a lot of clarity. Go back 1,000 years, my clarity is much less. It becomes murkier. We can go back to about the 700s to 900s BC, and we have a lot of good information. But once we go past 900 BC into the 1000, 1500, 2000 BC, things start to get very murky. And you'll read books about the ancient Near East in this time period that state things very confidently. And historians are going to do that. They're going to tell you their best impression of what's going on based on the information they have. But there's a lot of times they get it wrong, not intentionally, but we find evidence later that causes them to go back and revise what it is they said that has happened in the past. When we look back into 1,000 years before Christ, we see we have a lot of good information. But once we cross that divide of 1,000 years, which happens to be when Israel as a kingdom was founded, things get very murky. In the last 200 years, we've made lots of discoveries. We've discovered thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence, and in particular, clay tablets all throughout the Middle East, throughout the ancient Near East, as we will call it, that have script on it, cuneiform script or Akkadian script. And we've been able to learn a lot more about the things that have happened just over the past 200 years itself. In fact, prior to the 1900s or even the late 1800s, there were a lot of things that archaeologists or paleontologists said were wrong in the Bible simply because they hadn't found evidence to confirm it. That 100 years later, they found evidence that caused them to recant the fact that they had said the biblical record was wrong. So I say that to caveat that history is not settled science. We are... the other thing I want to say is most archaeologists in the world today and paleontologists who are secular in their viewpoint start with the assumption that the biblical record is wrong. It's just a collection of myths that might have something to say to us. And then they go out and they find their evidence and they build their story. So then what they build, they test what they build against the Bible and they say, well, the Bible's wrong. Whereas I'm going to start from the assumption that what I have here is not just a collection of myths and good stories. This is an actual, detailed, factual record of what has happened in history. And unless I have conclusive evidence that something is incorrect, I'm not going to assume this record's wrong. I'm going to start first here and then look at the record and try to interpret the evidence in light of what I already understand. And there are a handful of scientists, well-qualified people that do that. And when that handful of people, well-qualified biologists and chemists and archaeologists and paleontologists with degrees far more than I have, start from the assumption that the Bible is accurate, and then they look at the evidence, they're able to piece it together in a way that makes sense and does not contradict or prove the biblical record incorrect. And there are evidences and cases. We don't have time for those tonight. I would love to do just a whole talk on those. There are cases where, in actuality, the biblical record has caused us to find something that's there. The reason I created this yellow card is not to explain everything that's on it, but to give you a reference. So as we're talking about people or we're talking about dates, you can glance down and see where this all fits together. And I'm going to give credit here to Wade, too, as well, because the dates that I underlined on the left-hand side was something he mentioned to me not long ago about basically a dozen dates that you could memorize that give you a structure for the entire Bible so that you can understand anywhere you are in the Bible where that fits into the timeline of history. So I took that idea and combined it with this so that you have a good reference. So first, on the left-hand side, timeline of creation and redemption is what I've called this. I footnoted it, and you can go out and look online, either at the link I provided, or if you want to order or read the book by Edwin Teeley, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, that information is there for you as well. But essentially, I am unashamedly a young earth creationist. I believe the world was created just like God said it was. He spoke literally, and the world came into existence in 6 literal days, and on the 7th day he rested. And I believe it was created in 4004 BC. Now, you're going to find that the majority of secular academia would laugh at that. But I'll tell you that 20 years ago, I used to know all of the arguments really well. This was a hobby of mine 20 years ago. I haven't touched it since then, so I probably couldn't articulate those arguments now. But there are really good reasons to believe that this is an accurate date. And when it comes down to it, our record of what was happening prior to 2000 BC is very limited. And so it takes as much or more faith to believe that this world is millions upon millions of years old and that we evolved from monkeys than it does to simply believe that God created the earth and man like the Bible says. When it comes down to it, evolution is a theory because it's not been proven. Okay? And the evidence that is put forward to prove the theory of evolution is put forward under the assumption that this cannot possibly be true. So if you don't believe God and you don't think there is a God, you have to come up with something to explain how we got here. And you can come up with all kinds of notions and try to find evidence to fit into your notions to explain how we got here apart from God. But if you start with the assumption that this is accurate, the evidence still fits. The evidence that we have doesn't contradict this Bible. It's far too much to get into tonight. That's an entire separate series on creation and the science that's behind it, but I'll just say that about 4004. Moving into 2348, we have the flood of Noah. And by the way, the dates that I underlined, if you just memorize those dates and events, there's only 11 of them, I think, you can fit the rest of the Bible into that framework and know where you are as you study the Scripture. So we have the flood of Noah. I believe it was a global flood, not a local flood, that destroyed everything on this earth. And by the way, if you run the numbers from that time period until now, you can easily get the population of 7 billion people that we have in this world. If we had been populating this planet for millions and millions of years, we'd have a far bigger population crisis than we have now. But 7 billion is easy to get over 3,000 years. 1491, or 1921 BC, God's promise to Abraham. God says to Abram, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Through your offspring will everyone be blessed. In 1491, the Exodus. Now I put two other dates that there's actually good reason to believe the dates in parentheses as alternate options. In fact, I am now leaning more towards 1446 BC for the Exodus for reasons I won't get into tonight. But either of those dates is valid according to most folks who study this. The Exodus out of Egypt, Moses leads Israel out of slavery. In 1051 BC, King Saul is anointed and the kingdom of Israel is united. Prior to King Saul, Israel was a group of 12 tribes. They didn't have a king. They didn't have a single leader. They would band together in times of war, and they would put one of the judges of the nation up to lead them into battle. But until that time, it was a tribal system. Each tribe managed its own affairs. And then we have three kings, King Saul, King David, King Solomon. Each reigns for approximately 40 years, but in 931 BC, King Solomon dies, and he has a son, Rehoboam. Now, King Solomon had heavily taxed the people, and he had put a heavy burden of work upon the people. And when he died, the people came to his son, Rehoboam, and they said, please lighten this load of taxes, lighten this burden of work you've put on us. And Rehoboam said, not only will I not lighten it, I'm going to make it harder. And so Israel was 12 tribes. 10 of the tribes rebelled. And they formed their own kingdom in the north called the Kingdom of Israel. The two remaining tribes of Judah and Benjamin, of which Solomon was a part, Solomon was of the tribe of Judah, those two tribes remained in the south and they formed the Kingdom of Judah. So you have the entire united kingdom of Israel under Saul, David, and Solomon that splits into two with 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. You have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And it remains that way for the next couple hundred years. And all of the prophets that you see in the Old Testament are speaking to one of these two kingdoms, either the north or the south. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire defeats the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel's capital is in the town of Samaria. And the Assyrian king, Assyria was the first great world empire that ruled the entire area of the ancient Near East. the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V came in and destroyed Samaria. And when he destroyed Samaria, what he did is he expatriated, he took people in the kingdom of Israel and he resettled them across his empire. And then he brought people from outside of the empire and moved them into Samaria. And why did he do that? He mixed the people around because the idea was if I get them to intermarry and to move to different locations, they'll be easier to manage. They won't rise up as a people or ethnic group and rebel against me. And so when you fast forward to the New Testament, 700 years later, who do the Jews hate? Samaritans. Why? The Samaritans were the lost 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel who had been dispersed and intermarried with all of the different nations. And so from the Jews' perspective, the Jews were the southern 2 tribes, the kingdom of Judah. From their perspective, that was a dirty, filthy people that had been intermarried with all of the other nations. They were not truly part of Israel. In 586, moving on down, 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt and the Assyrians, and he captures Judah, the southern kingdom now. In that moment, in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar captures Jerusalem, he carries some important figures that you've probably all heard of off to Babylon. Anyone know who those are? That's right, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, those 4 men, along with others. But when we read about Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the furnace, or Daniel in the lion's den, those 4 men were removed from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, in the first capture of Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem rebels, and in 597, Nebuchadnezzar comes back and attacks Jerusalem. And he removes Jehoiakim, who's the king at the time, and exports him to Babylon. And in place of Jehoiakim, he puts a man by the name of Zedekiah. Actually, that's the name Nebuchadnezzar gives him, because if you name the person that you put in charge, you're demonstrating your control over them. So Nebuchadnezzar puts a man by the name of Zedekiah in charge in 597 BC. But Zedekiah, he reigns for 11 years, but he decides to rebel too. So this is now the 3rd time that Nebuchadnezzar comes back, and in this time, in 586 BC, he's angry, he destroys the entire city. He destroys the temple, he destroys the walls, he just levels the entire city. He kills the sons of Zedekiah in front of him and then puts Zedekiah's eyes out and says, the last thing you will see is your sons dying in front of you. And then Zedekiah is never heard from after that. He's taken into captivity. So this is the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the moment at which now the Jews, the kingdom of Judah, who we now call Jews, are moved into captivity in Babylon. But Babylon was the second great empire. Assyria was the first. They destroyed the northern kingdom. Babylon eventually beat Assyria. Then they destroyed the southern kingdom. Now the third empire comes on the scene, and the third empire is the Persians. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, comes in and conquers Babylon, and so they are the ruling empire in the entire ancient Near East. And in fact, Persia controls more territory in the world than any other empire has ever controlled up until that point. And when Persia captures Babylon, Cyrus the Great issues a decree, a proclamation that says all of the Jews who have been in captivity all of this time in Babylon can now go back to their homeland. That is where the book of Ezra is going to start. When we jump into chapter 1 next week, it's 539 BC, and the King Cyrus the Great issues a proclamation that says all of the Jews in captivity can now go back to their homeland. All right, fast forward through these dates. We're going to watch the temple get rebuilt during the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That is finished in 516 BC. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great, the leader of Greece, comes through and destroys the Persian Empire and takes over. And now the Greek Empire is the biggest empire that the world has seen. Rome defeats Greece in 146 BC, and then in 4 BC, Jesus is born. Why 4 BC and not 0? That's a conversation for another night. But suffice it to say, Herod the Great, who was the king that killed all of the babies in Bethlehem, died in 4 BC, so Jesus could not have been born past that date. 30 AD, 34 years later, Jesus is crucified, raised from the dead, and then 40 years after that, the second temple that you're going to see rebuilt in the book of Ezra, that temple gets destroyed. And that is where we are today. There has been no temple in Jerusalem since that temple got destroyed in 70 AD. All right. Just a note on the Persian kings. On the bottom right, you see a table of kings. So you're going to hear the term Achaemenid, the Achaemenid dynasty or the Achaemenid kings. What that refers to is the Persian Empire. So Persia has been a country for a long time. In fact, Iranians today are Persians. They speak Persian Farsi. They don't speak Arabic in Iran. They speak Persian Farsi. They don't speak Arabic in Afghanistan. They speak Persian Dari. It's a different dialect, but the Iranians and the Afghans can understand each other when they speak Persian because they're a Persian people. So when we say the Achaemenids, we're talking about a specific period of time in Persian history where this empire reigned across the entire Middle East there. And the reason it's called Achaemenid is because the family that ruled the Persian Empire was originally a nomadic family. And they eventually began conquering, and one of their first kings was named Achaemenes. So all of the Persian kings traced their lineage to this king Achaemenes, and we call them the Achaemenid dynasty or the Achaemenid kings. So you're going to see that alternatively. I'm just going to call them Persian kings, but you're going to see that when you read things, when you go and you look at histories or you hear people talking about the history, so that's why I throw that out there. We have Cyrus the Great, 539. He established the Persian Empire. I put in boldface events that are related to Ezra and Nehemiah on that table of kings, okay? Then we have Camses, conquered Egypt. We have Bardiah, he had a short reign, didn't do anything significant. We have Darius or Darius the First. Under Darius, we're going to read about Darius in Ezra and Nehemiah. The empire of Persia reached its largest size. And there's a man named Tatnai, who's the governor of the province in Ezra and Nehemiah, and Tatnai is going to write Darius. So that's good to remember where Darius is on this table. Then we move on to Xerxes the First. This is the guy that we think married Esther. So when you read the book of Esther, this is where Esther fits in on the timeline. Also, if you've seen the movie 300, if you've not seen it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going to see it. It's very violent, very bloody. But the movie 300 is based on a battle called the Battle of Thermopylae. That was the failed attempt of King Xerxes to invade Greece. And King Xerxes took his army into Greece, but the Greeks, 300 of them, along with another few hundred soldiers from other areas, stood against hundreds of thousands of Persian troops in a small, narrow gap, and they held them off for several days. And that's what that movie's based on. Then we get to Artaxerxes I, who is the son of Xerxes, and this is the predominant figure in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. He is the reigning Persian king during the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah. All right, I'm going to stop with the history. Are there any questions at this point? Yeah. Oh, really? They can, yeah. So for those that, are we online? Okay. For those that are just coming online, if you want a copy of this timeline, yes, they can send an email to me, Aaron, Aaron, at emmanuelena.org, or contact us, one word, at emmanuelena.org. You're not asking me to re-say all that, are you? Oh, thankfully. Actually, I wouldn't mind, but we don't have time tonight. Yes?
Stephen Myers is a great source if you want to research things on creation, evolution. He's a scientist, and he's got a Christian base.
Okay.
Like what you were talking about.
Thanks for that. So Stephen Myers, I'll take a look. Thank you for that. All right, moving on. Let's look at the author and structure of Ezra and Nehemiah. So I hyphenated it because it was originally one scroll. And in fact, as far as the Jews were concerned, it was one scroll all the way until the 1500s, until only a few hundred years ago they considered it one book. And now if you go and you look at just a Hebrew Bible minus the New Testament, you're going to see it separated into two books like we did. It did get separated, but it was kind of artificial. It was separated by the early church fathers when they translated the Bible into Latin. The Latin Bible is called the Vulgate. And so when they created the Latin Vulgate, they separated these two books out, and they called them First Ezra and Second Ezra. And then later, it was during the Reformation of the Christian church when they started calling Second Ezra the book of Nehemiah. And what you're going to find as we go through this, let me make sure I'm not missing anything. So what you're going to find as you go through is that Ezra and Nehemiah, it doesn't read like some of the books of the Bible that you're used to reading, where it's just a single narrative, single story. Ezra and Nehemiah consolidates a bunch of different documents. So there are memos, there are letters, there are decrees that are pieced together along with a couple of chunks of narrative. And so what we think happened is that we'll call this person the chronicler. The chronicler consolidated all of this information into a single book, and the same person likely wrote First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, and many people think that this chronicler was Ezra himself. We don't know that for sure. We don't have a way to prove for certain that it was Ezra himself who pulled this together. What we do know is that Ezra wrote some of the narrative, and Nehemiah wrote some of the narrative, and then there were letters and there were decrees, and then somebody put all of that together into a single scroll. And so what you'll find is that there are three major parts to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I'm just going to treat them as if they're still one book. We're going to go straight through Ezra, then we're going to go straight through Nehemiah. There are three main parts. The first 6 chapters we're going to look at over the next few weeks is what people would call the book of Zerubbabel. It's just a 6-chapter description of what happens from the time that Cyrus gives a decree until the people return to the land and they begin rebuilding the temple. And so that's a big section of just narrative, of story. And the reason they call it the book of Zerubbabel is because he's the main character in this early first 6 chapters. Now, when the action of Ezra chapters 1 through 6 is going on, Ezra is not yet in Jerusalem. This is happening 80 years before Ezra gets there. So if you look at your timeline, I put on the right-hand side in boldface, 538 BC, the book of Ezra begins here. But Ezra is not yet in Jerusalem. In fact, he may not even be born yet when this book starts. So we have those first 6 chapters starting in 538 BC, and then if you look down, Ezra gets to Jerusalem in 458 BC, which is 80 years later. Now, the second big section is what we call the Ezra memoir. This is the section that Ezra probably wrote himself. Whether he put the whole book together or not, he wrote this section, and he describes his experiences going back to Jerusalem. Ezra is a priest, and he's a scribe, and he is sent back to oversee the construction of the temple, or the reinstitution of worship in the temple is what I should say, because the temple's already been completed when he gets there. But he's sent back to oversee the restoration of worship in the temple. And then the third major chunk is what we call the Nehemiah memoir. And this is Nehemiah's firsthand account. Sometimes he's talking firsthand, sometimes it's third person, but this is his account of going back. Now, Nehemiah is not a priest and a scribe. He is a government official. We're going to find out he's what's called a cupbearer to the king, which is actually a significant position in the Persian Empire, and he is sent back to be the governor of the province of Judah. All right? Now, this book is written in 2 languages. It's written in Aramaic and it's written in Hebrew. Why? Because the official language of the entire empire at that time was called Imperial Aramaic. Aramaic was the predominant language, not Persian. Persians still spoke Persian, but Aramaic had been the language of the Assyrians, it had been the language of the Babylonians, and now it was the language of empire for the Persians. And so when all of the Jews come out of exile in Babylon, most of the common people are not speaking Hebrew anymore. They're speaking Aramaic. Those who remembered the homeland in Israel, or those who were learned and educated, probably spoke Hebrew. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are writing in both languages as they consolidate this book. All right, political setting. So Artaxerxes, if you look on your timeline there on the bottom right, I boldfaced that. Like I said, he is the leader that matters most here in the book of, I don't know, I wouldn't say he matters the most, because Cyrus is the one who issues the proclamation to allow them to return. But Artaxerxes is as predominant here in major sections of the Bible, of the Ezra and Nehemiah books. So during the action that we're going to be talking about, he's the king of the Persian Empire. I'm going to show you a picture of the Persian Empire. All right? It was expansive. It goes all the way on the west side. We have northern Egypt, all the way up to the eastern part of Greece and Turkey. You have what is now modern-day Syria and Israel and Jordan. All the way, if you went up here, you've got the countries of Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan up here. This is the modern-day country of Iran, right in the middle. The capital was at a place called Persepolis. And then off to the east, you've got Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. All of those countries is what you would see there in the eastern part of the empire. And so Cyrus and Artaxerxes and Xerxes ruled all of this territory from their capital here in Persepolis. Now, some of them spent a lot of time in Susa. So when you read the book of Esther, and you see that Esther married the king had a citadel, had a palace also in Susa that he liked to spend time in. So you're going to see that in the book of Esther. Now, if you're an emperor and you're reigning, or a king, and you're trying to rule this vast, expansive territory, what are you going to do? You're going to do it all yourself? What's that? You're going to give it to other people. So just like we would do now, they divided it into provinces, and these provinces were called satrapies. S-A-T-R-A-P-Y, satrapy. And satrapies were ruled by satraps. So in the Bible, in Ezra and Nehemiah, you're going to read the title satrap. A satrap is a governor. The satrap governs a satrapy. And so you're going to read in Ezra and Nehemiah of a satrapy called Beyond the River. That's the name of the province of Beyond the River. Abar Nahara is what it would be in Aramaic. And that is this province that's over here. It's not marked in this area. But why is it called Beyond the River? Because this is the Jordan River over here in Palestine, and this section of land west of the river is called the province of Beyond the River. And there's a satrap, a governor named Tatnai, who's going to be over that land. And the province of Judah is like a sub-province within the satrap of Beyond the River. Okay? So that's what we're looking at. Now I'm going to show you this line, that box there that you see, the bigger square is where the Jews were in exile in Babylon, and then they're going to immigrate back to their homeland to the left on that map to where Israel is and where the kingdom of Judah used to be, to the province of Judah. And this is what that province looked like. The province, it would have been called the province of Yehud, the province of Judah. And what you see is Judah, it's actually fairly small now. It's not, modern day Israel would encompass this entire map. This is the Jordan River on the right-hand side, and the province of Beyond the River is all of this land, but then there's the sub-province of Judah, Yehud, right here, with Jerusalem in the center. To the west, that was settled by Phoenicians, who were a seafaring trading people. To the south, you have Idumeans. Those are the descendants of Edom. Who is Edom? Anybody remember who Edom was? It's another name for Esau. That was the brother of Jacob. So these are the relatives of the Jews. These are all the descendants of Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, the father of all of the Jews. And then up to the north, we have Samaria, which is the old Israel kingdom that was conquered by Assyria, and all the peoples were resettled. So those are the Samaritans. And then east, you have some other provinces and groups of people as well. So we'll come back to this map periodically because you're going to read about all of these people that oppose the Jews and their work in trying to rebuild the walls and trying to rebuild the temple. And you're thinking, where in the world are these people coming from, and who are they, and why do they get to have a say? And so we're going to talk about those things here in the political environment that it's in. Let's go to 2 Kings now. We're going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. So why did the Jews get sent into exile? Well, that's not why, but we're going to read about when they got sent into the exile. Basically, they got sent to exile because that's what all of the prophets had said was going to happen. If you didn't turn from your idols, if you didn't turn from your wicked ways, if you didn't return to the Lord and repent of the evil that you've committed, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to send my servant Nebuchadnezzar in to tear apart your land. And that's what, in fact, God does. And so we're going to look at 2 Kings chapter 24. And we'll probably skip a little bit around in this here, all the way through 25, 22. So starting in chapter 24, in his days, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant 3 years. So when did Nebuchadnezzar come up and Jehoiakim become his servant? That was in 605 BC if you look on your timeline. On the on the left-hand side, 605, Babylon defeats Egypt and Assyria. And essentially, prior to this time, Israel, or rather the kingdom of Judah under Jehoiakim, or rather under his dad, Josiah, had fought the Egyptians and lost. And so Judah at this point is a vassal, meaning they're a servant of Egypt. The king of Judah is a servant king to the king of Egypt right at this time. But in 605, when Nebuchadnezzar beats Egypt, now they become a servant, a vassal king to Nebuchadnezzar. And the Lord sent against him, and the Lord sent against Jehoiakim bands of the Chaldeans and bands of the Syrians and bands of the Moabites and bands of the Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done. So we see the Lord caused this. The Lord says, I will send my servant Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to talk more about this next week and the sovereignty of God and the way that God uses even wicked kings for his ends. He sends Nebuchadnezzar in to destroy the land. So it says, starting back in verse 5, now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin, notice the K-I-N versus the C-H-I-N, Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. And the king of Egypt did not come again to take out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. Now Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Nehushta, and the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came back to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mother and his servants and his officials and his palace officials. So this is happening in 605. So Jehoiakim, K-I-M, was king, but he dies. Jehoiachin, his son, C-H-I-N, takes over, and he's only been on the throne for 3 months when Nebuchadnezzar comes in 605. And he removes Jehoiakim from the throne, and he puts Jehoiakim's uncle, Mattaniah, on the throne and renames Mattaniah Zedekiah. And we're going to see this. The king of Babylon took Jehoiakim prisoner in the 8th year of his reign and carried off all the treasures of that's the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon the king of Israel had made. So notice Nebuchadnezzar is going to steal all of the gold and silver and implements of the temple, and this is going to come into play in chapter 1 and 2 of Ezra. Skip down to verse 16. The king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and the metalworkers, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiakim's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. And when it talks about him removing these people, that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going with Nebuchadnezzar in this first wave of exiles that leave Jerusalem. Now Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. That's from 597 BC on your outline until 586 BC. That's when Zedekiah is going to reign in Judah. Verse 19, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now Zedekiah is going to rebel against Babylon a few years before Babylon comes back. But Babylon's a little bit busy with their empire. They're busy taking care of some other enemies, and he rebels against them, but they're eventually going to come back. And they're going to come back in about 588 BC, and they're going to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem for 18 months. They're going to surround the city and starve the city out. And so when you read the book of Jeremiah, a portion of that covers this 18-month siege when the city is surrounded by the Babylonians, and there's no food and there's no water, and they're literally finding anything they can find to eat. Rats, mice, snakes, whatever they can find in the city, they're going to eat that because they're hungry. Chapter 25, and in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So for 2 years nearly, it's under siege. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden, though the Chaldeans were around the city. And they went in the direction of the Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. They captured the king, and they brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah. Riblah was the headquarters of Nebuchadnezzar during his campaign. And they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains and took him to Babylon. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all of the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down, and all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. And the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried them into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. And the pillars of bronze that were in the house of the Lord, and the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans broke into pieces and carried the bronze to Babylon. And they took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the dishes for the incense and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple, the fire pans also and the bowls. What was of gold, the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was of silver, as silver. As for the 2 pillars, the one sea, and the stands that Solomon had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all those vessels was beyond weight. The height of one pillar was 18 cubits, and on it was a capital of bronze. The height of the capital was 3 cubits. The latticework and pomegranates of all bronze were all around the capital, and the second pillar had the same. And the captain of the guard took Sariah the chief priest, and Zephaniah the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the threshold, and from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the men of war, and 5 men of the king's council who were found in the city, and the secretary of the commander of the army who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land who were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. And over the people who remained in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, the governor. So it's a really long passage, but what you see is Nebuchadnezzar conquers the city. Zedekiah tries to run away with his men of war. He gets captured, he gets killed. And then Nebuchadnezzar sends his captain back to the city to burn everything down. They're taking everything they can find. They're just looting the city, everything they can find. They take what leaders remain in the city up to Nebuchadnezzar's camp, and they kill them, and then he puts his own governor on the throne. And so this is the 3rd time Nebuchadnezzar's been back to Jerusalem, and what you read through the prophets, or what you're going to read here in Ezra and Nehemiah, is that people say, that city, Jerusalem, you shouldn't let them rebuild the walls, you shouldn't let them rebuild the temple, because it's a rebellious city. Just look at the history books. So you're going to see this happen in Ezra and Nehemiah. So I want you to get a feel. 3 times Jerusalem rebelled, and 3 times Nebuchadnezzar comes. And on that 3rd time, he just destroys everything because he is fed up with the rebelliousness of this land. So that is the destruction and the exile. Other notable features, a few other things to note about the time in exile. So when the Jews get carried off to the land of Babylon, they are settled all across the land. Not all of them are in slavery or servitude. We have records, we have evidence of Jews who were owned fields, who were farmers, who worked in different trades. Some of them surely were servants and slaves in Babylon, but they were scattered not in one place, but all across the land of Babylon in multiple cities. And some of them integrated quite well into the culture, it appears, because when it's time for the exiles to go back, not all of them choose to go back. We'll talk more about that next week. Another notable thing is that this forever changed worship in the life of the Jews. The temple was destroyed. And when the temple was destroyed, all temple sacrifice ceased. And the Old Testament, the Mosaic law, had told the Jews that you may only sacrifice where I choose to put my name. So once that first temple was built, they were not allowed to sacrifice anywhere else. So when they're carried off into exile and the temple's been destroyed, there are now no more sacrifices. Sacrifices have been stopped. And they will not occur again until the temple is rebuilt. So during that time, when they have no temple to go to worship at, and they can't do these sacrifices, you see a shift in the emphasis on the keeping of the Sabbath. You see a shift on the emphasis of prayer and the emphasis of fasting and the emphasis of the study of Scripture. And you see a people who, in part, truly become humbled by the events of being exiled. And now they realize that God is serious, and we're going to take our faith seriously, and we're going to study, and we're going to pray, and we're going to pray that God restores that which He's taken away from us. You see the shift in language that we talked about. Now, undoubtedly, the people spoke Aramaic before they were taken into exile, but while they're in exile, it appears that many of them adopt that as their primary language, and to some degree, Hebrew speaking is lost. And during this time, some speculate this is where synagogues were developed. They don't have a temple anymore. There were no synagogues before this time because everybody went to the temple to worship. But in the absence of the temple, they started forming these synagogues. These synagogues were small houses of prayer, houses of study. And then when they come back into the land of Judah, then they're going to set up these houses of study and worship. And now you can go anywhere in the world, right, and you can find synagogues. But until this time, those synagogues did not exist within the Jewish religion. Now, we don't know for sure they started during this time. It might have been a little bit later. But rabbinic tradition, Jewish tradition, is that it started during the exile. We're going to talk more about this later, but I want to point out this is all part of God's plan. In fact, Amos chapter 6, or chapter 3, verse 6, I'll have to go back and look at my notes. Amos says that when disaster comes upon a city, has not the Lord caused it? And it's a rhetorical question. And certainly here, the writer of Kings, 2 Kings, tells us specifically that the Lord sent this on to them because of the evil that they had done. Daniel's prophecy, and we're going to end here. So, Daniel is one of the first exiles that is taken into captivity in 605 BC. And he serves in that land for a long time until Cyrus the Great comes on the scene. So when does Cyrus the Great come in to power? 539. So Daniel is in Babylon serving the different empires. He serves the Babylonians, and then he serves the Persians, at least from 605 BC all the way until 539 BC. So over 60 years, nearly 70 years, he himself serves. And while Daniel is there, in Babylon, he reads the prophet Jeremiah. He gets out the scroll of Jeremiah. He's reading through Jeremiah, and he comes across the following passage. Turn to Jeremiah 25, verse 8 through 14. Jeremiah 25, 8 through 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. The whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then, after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. So this is what Daniel is in captivity reading. Jeremiah lived right before, in Jerusalem, at the time of the capture. Right? So Jeremiah lived just before, at the same time as Daniel, really. But Jeremiah was in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it, and he writes this. But he writes it even before Nebuchadnezzar comes. Now Daniel, several years later, is in Jerusalem, and he's in Babylon, and he's reading what Jeremiah wrote, and then he comes to this conclusion. Go to Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. In the first year of Darius the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So Daniel perceives, he's reading Jeremiah, and he realizes God promised to send Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the kingdom of Judah, to destroy the temple and the city, and to take us into captivity, but he promised also that it's only going to last 70 years. And so now Daniel realizes that the end of captivity is near. And that's what's going to lead us into chapter 1 of Ezra.